second speaker is Mark R. from Atascadero, California. Mark has been committed to a life in 12-step programming since 1994, when he admitted he was powerless over alcohol and that his life had become unmanageable. Since then, he has explored living through AA and then ACA when he discovered that his emotional sobriety depended on taking a deeper look at behaviors and attitudes he learned growing up in an alcoholic and dysfunctional family. Mark has experienced the gift of sponsorship, both as a sponsee and a sponsor many times over the past 27 years, and feels that sponsorship has been the keystone of his recovery life. And I'm delighted to know Mark pretty well and delighted to turn it over to you, Mark.
All right. Well, thank you, Bob. And good morning, good afternoon, or evening, or wherever you are. Thank you for both Bob and Lucy for their hosting. Sponsorship has been a foundation stone for my recovery in both AA and ACA. I'm going to tell you about some of my experiences, both as sponsor and sponsee, and the things that I've learned from them. Some of these have been in AA, and some of them have been in ACA, but I've found that the lessons I've learned in one fellowship apply across all of them, since they're based on the same principles. When I was a newcomer, people would ask me numerous times, do you have a sponsor? And my answer was, not yet. And I was already feeling like it was a pretty big deal just to show up to meetings. And the thought of entering into a sponsor relationship kind of terrified me at that point. You know, I had a whole string of questions that were kind of like, well, gee, what if I choose somebody and I hate them? Is this forever? Will they dump me? Just how trusting does this relationship need to be? Do I have to tell them everything? Just exactly what are we going to be doing anyway? And what if the guidance is wrong? Will it ruin my recovery? What if the guidance is right? Will I be able to respond? Will I want to respond? Will he be telling me things I don't want to hear? Do I always have to do what he says? Is he responsible for my recovery? So probably I'll answer a lot of these through my descriptions, and I hope that your anxiety level will be lower about sponsoring and being a sponsee after you've heard the four of us. And if you still have burning questions, feel free to ask in our Q&A section. So for starters, I'll talk about how I found my first sponsor. I'd been about a month or two into going to meetings and kind of watching people. And I noticed a guy who seemed to kind of get recovery, and we seemed to be speaking the same language. And it looked to me like what he said and what he did in his life were the same, which encouraged me to trust him. So I talked to him regularly in the meetings after the meeting, and got more comfortable. And finally, I got up the courage and asked him to be my sponsor. He smiled and said, of course. So now what? We set up a schedule of weekly get-togethers and phone calls, and agreed on several meetings a week that we could commit to attending together. And then after a bit of mutual introduction, we talked very briefly about expectations and run roles, and started right in on step one. So what were those expectations and run roles, though? For him, it was just really simple. Being open-minded as to what he and the program were going to be suggesting to me, being honest with myself and with him, being willing to work the program, and being committed to do what it takes to grow in recovery. So, there weren't a bunch of rules and regulations. It was more of a principles of relationship. And that actually turned out to be really helpful. We stuck really close to the big book and reading and discussing it from front to back and worked the steps one at a time, making sure that one step made a solid stepping stone for the next one. We talked about daily life challenges and triumphs and how they affected my sobriety and recovery. And I developed a relationship with a higher power and was encouraged to stick close to it. He answered a lot of questions I had about the program, and we explored AA history together, which was kind of helpful. He was diligent about things like remembering sobriety birthdays and disciplined about meeting commitments and getting together and such. And that really helped me to feel loved in a way that I had not previously encountered, especially in my family. In this case, the relationship was kind of a father-teacher/student-child relationship, which at that point was kind of what I needed because I was in full life panic. It helped me to be clear that, and he helped me to be clear that it was my responsibility to work the program, and he was here to help me along the way. So that some of the takeaways from that experience were the openness, willingness, honesty, and commitment really were good principles to work this with, and were key to our success. Our common superpower was that both of us were really motivated by recovery. A funny thing was that after we started working together, we discovered that we were both optical scientists working at competing companies. And this partially explains why we spoke the same language, because it was kind of an arcane career. So you know, we had things to talk about professionally, or not talk about it, as the case may be, because of security stuff. But our common motivations for recovery turned out to be far more important than this common career thing. Really high point for me in this first sponsor experience was when Bob listened to my fifth step, and there was I went into it with complete honesty on my part. The second time around, I tried it once and discovered that I had more stuff to dig out, and so the second time around, I just emptied it all. And on Bob's part, he was completely compassionate and accepting. And you know, once we were finished with this, I became totally aware that God had known all along who I was to my core and loved me unconditionally, changed my life. And I really am grateful to Bob R. for creating the environment in which this could happen. Our biggest challenge was my tendency to blur our sponsorship roles with my need for a healthy father figure. Clarity on this would have to wait for a couple of decades until I stumbled into ACA, because I really, you know, had no clue about boundaries and things like that at that point. Neither of us knew much, well, neither of us really knew about ACA or second stage sobriety at this point, but we still were exactly what we needed for each other. And I found out something kind of fun, that you don't have to be a seasoned expert to be a sponsor. After about 6 years, he moved to Arizona, and this was in the previous century, in a time long before Zoom. So it made it really difficult. And after much struggle and separation anxiety and abandonment feelings, I asked his permission to find a new sponsor. And he said, of course, and reminded me that I didn't need his permission. and he thanked me for being his first sponsoree. And I was really astonished. I had no idea. So my first experience as a sponsor happened about a year into recovery, and I had recently arrived at the 12th step for the first time. I had been talking with my sponsor about various service opportunities I might explore, and we both agreed that sponsoring somebody might be a good one. And I was a bit intimidated by the idea, but he helped me by reminding me that I am responsible for the footwork and God is in charge of the results. Sponsoring isn't for everybody, but the way to find out if it was for me is to try it. And I have noticed that sponsoring works well for me in some parts of my life and not so much in other parts, depending on what's going on in my life and what's going on in my recovery. So I think it's one of those being close to God things that you just know. And I noticed so back on how I got my first sponsoree, I noticed there was this guy named Bill who seemed highly motivated to be in recovery, but seemed a bit lost. It seemed like we could communicate easily, but I hinted to him a number of times that finding a sponsor might be good for him, as folks had suggested to me when I was a newcomer. But he seemed like he really might want me to be a sponsor, but he kept not asking. So finally, I just said, "Hey, Bill, you want me to be your sponsor?" And he seemed hugely relieved and said, "Well, yes." So I sponsored him by an approach that was basically channeling what Bob R., my first sponsor, had been for me, as well as I was capable. I asked my sponsor lots of questions because I was afraid I was going to mess up, but mostly he said, "Don't worry, you're doing fine." And he said, "Do what the big book says." And I was Bill's sponsor from 1995 until last year when he passed away. There were some challenges and successes in this. I quickly discovered that the best way to be an effective sponsor is to be actively working my own recovery program and being open about it. Opportunities to model healthy attitudes, behaviors, and recovery and channel God's love really stemmed from that. The other best way to be an effective sponsor is to be a careful, non-judgmental listener while working the 12 steps as described in the big book and the big red book. Bill and nearly everyone else I have sponsored have been eager to let me know how their lives have become unmanageable and where their powerlessness lies. And that has pointed the direction directly to step 2. Working step 2 while carefully listening has pointed the direction to step 3, etc. One thing that I've noticed is that there's no certificate program to be a sponsor, but having worked through the 12 steps is pretty important. And I think of it as like a trail guide who has been up the mountain before. You know where the path is and where you're going, but you have no idea what the conditions are going to be like this time. But it helps to have been there. The best apprenticeship for being a sponsor is being sponsored yourself. And I learned that sponsorship is an exercise in humility, knowing that there is a God and I'm not it, and learning and accepting my own strengths and limitations, being okay with uncertainty and journeying together, including traveling through some really dark times, accepting my powerlessness over other people's actions and accepting responsibility for my own, shining a light along the path of recovery for a sponsee, and then getting out of the way to make room for God to carry them. And one thing that it makes me laugh sometimes, but it's true, My first sponsor said, never confuse my 12th step with someone else's first step. In my sponsorship of Bill, our biggest challenge was overcoming complacency. Bill liked to stay in his comfort zone, and I was deep into people pleasing at that point. And sponsoring Bill helped me believe that part of a sponsor's job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, has been said of spiritual leaders. Our biggest success was commitment to each other in recovery. So what do I do when I think it's not working? Remember that I'm not God, and I'm responsible for offering what I have and who I am, and God takes care of the results. And being careful of my prideful investment in the relationship, which is easy for me to slide into. Offer only solutions. Codependent behavior isn't really a solution leading to recovery. Having faith that God can work in people's lives even when I can't see it. I had a sponsoree who ran from our sponsoring relationship when I pressed him to look at his part in his life's unmanageability. I didn't see him for 15 years, and then one day he saw me on the street, stopped me, and almost crying, told me that he was several years sober and was grateful for the seeds I'd planted. And another one who said he wanted me to sponsor him, and then he wouldn't work the steps. He was clearly resenting my efforts and not being truthful to me. And after a while, frustrated, I terminated our sponsor relationship. Several years later, he began showing up in meetings and made amends to me, and is thriving in recovery with someone else being his sponsor. Lastly, on this, remembering again that my 12 step isn't and someone else's first step are not the same thing. I gave the best I had to offer in recovery to a guy for a couple of years, but he ended up dead of alcoholism, and I had to recognize and accept my powerlessness and just let it go as between him and God. So I found my ACA sponsor, my one and only ACA sponsor so far, when I was looking for something else. My AA program and I weren't working effectively together at this point. I began acting out and really hurting people and myself, and I didn't know why. I didn't have an urge to drink or drugs, so I thought I was okay, and I was wrong. So my wife suggested I go to a workshop in Los Angeles being hosted by Herb Kagan and Alan Berger on second stage recovery and emotional sobriety. I went to it and cried through the whole workshop because it was exactly what I needed to hear. Herb, at the end, I talked to Herb and he suggested I get a hold of a guy named Bob Kay in the Central Coast area, close to where I live. So I looked up Bob and got to talking with him, and quickly he became my sponsor. And this was in about August of 2017. And that's where my ACA journey started. And some of the things that Bob has taught me as my sponsor are I am loved unconditionally, and I'm fundamentally okay, a child of God. And it's good and healthy to love myself. As an addict, I have a condition that requires me to live.
2 minutes.
Thank you. Requires living the 12-step program each day. As a child in an alcoholic and dysfunctional family, I developed a toolkit of survival skills that I still use instinctively, especially when triggered, that are often not useful as they were when I was a child and had no other options. But my laundry list traits can be integrated and become part of my strength and integrity. Today, as an adult, I have options, and Bob helps me to discover what these are. He's helped me a lot in understanding PTSD from childhood trauma and how that affects my recovery, and unprocessed shame and grief as well. My feelings, he's helped me to realize that my feelings are real and deserve to be listened to and felt, and they are not the enemy. Anger expressed in a healthy way equals intimacy. That was a real surprise to me. And we've had multifaceted relationships, sometimes an authority figure when I need that, sometimes as a fellow traveler when that's what works for us. Always a condition allowing honesty and direct communication, always having compassion for each other as human children of God. And I believe that Bob will always be there for me, and I can always call on him to engage in sponsorship. To wrap up, here's a summary of my approach to sponsorship in ACA. We are fellow travelers with relationships based on mutual openness, honesty, willingness, and commitment to our recovery. I do my best to channel all the things I've learned from my previous sponsors, and I work to create a relationship and environment of safety and unconditional love. We use the big red book. We do the steps rigorously, and we make use of support materials like the yellow workbook and the laundry list workbook and stuff like that. Journaling, and I support the use of therapists and other medical professionals as part of a complete program of recovery. We meet regularly, and I've learned the power of the somatic body wisdom as a spokesman for the inner child and relationships between working through stored trauma and recovery. What I've been reminded is that my job as sponsor is to illuminate the path and get out of the way so God has room to work. My service is a primary sustaining activity in recovery, and the service of sponsorship is one of the greatest joys in my life. So thanks.